Hey there. Welcome to the Astro Psyche. So this is what I'm calling an Astro Chat, live stream Astro Chat here on my Instagram, the.astro.psyche on Instagram. And I wanted to today share with you a portion of my thesis research that I did for my master's degree in counseling psychology. And so I'm going to start with pulling some tarot cards to set the tone for the session for today, this container, this chatting space. And before I do that, I'll share with you that the reason that I wanted to come on and to share this topic with you is that I'll be presenting my thesis research very briefly this weekend at my commencement ceremony. And so this is sort of like a combination wanting to share with you and also wanting to more practically just time myself and go through a practice run, so to speak. It's not going to be exactly the same because I have a PowerPoint that I'll be sharing this weekend when I'm on campus. So of course you won't be able to see that, but I'm going to do my best to convey things to you. And again, this is kind of, you're sort of helping me to create a space where I need to time myself to practice because I find that's helpful. So I want to pull some cards to just sort of set the tone for this topic and just set the tone for today as well. So this is sort of an interesting week because we have Mars, Jupiter, and Pluto very active together, very strongly together this week. And we also have a first quarter moon in Virgo. So a lot of sort of like energy around taking action and getting things done or feeling the pressure to get things done. So I'm wondering how you're feeling this week or whenever you're watching this. So I'm pulling from the Muse Tarot deck. And if you have a particular question or inquiry whenever you're watching this, it doesn't have to be the week that I'm recording it. I want you to hold that topic in your heart. And if you're in a safe space to do so, you can close your eyes and focus on your breathing, focus on your breath. If it feels uncomfortable to be still, you can close your eyes, but bring in some movement again if you're in a safe space to do so. Okay. Okay. So the card that I pulled is the Eight of Materials. This is also known as the Eight of Pentacles in the Smith-Waite deck. This is one of my favorite cards in this deck. It has this figure who almost kind of looks like she's juggling a bunch of roses, and then she has this really beautiful big pink rose bloom coming out of the crown of her head. And so this card is so perfect for my topic. I don't know if I mentioned this earlier, but my topic is the Psychopomp for my thesis research that I'll be summarizing and sharing with you in a moment. And a Psychopomp is essentially a mythic figure or supernatural being that guides souls through other worlds, usually after death. And so the Psychopomp is a figure of transition, of journeys, of going from one place to another. And the Eight of Materials is a card that is about beginning a journey, and it's usually about leaving or going away from something. And I don't know if this resonates with you at this particular moment, but the Eight of Materials also has sort of a sense of like disappointment or sadness about it. It's kind of like a leaving a situation where you feel like you wish that things had gone in a different way. There's like this sadness about leaving, but the leaving is still necessary. The leaving is still the thing that that feels the best, even though it's a difficult situation. And if you're like, Shawna, I'm not leaving any situations, then it's usually an indicator to look at where, I'm also, when I'm looking at this card, I'm really drawn to, there's, gosh, it's so hard to see here on the film, but there are some roses that she's flipping up towards the sky, and then there's some roses that there's a line from her palm down to the rose, and it's almost as if she's dropping it. So this card feels like even if you're not leaving a situation, or it's not possible or desirable to leave a situation, it's about letting go of things. It's about surrender. And this is such a perfect emblem for this topic, because this is what the Psychopomp is it's about surrender and transition and having the strength to move through an initiatory period that can sometimes be exciting, but also sort of difficult at the same time. So with that, we'll start. So I titled my thesis, The Psychopomp Function, and it will become more clear sort of why I did that. One of the quotes that I want to start with is from Carolyn Conger from her book Through the Dark Forest. And in The Dark Forest, she writes about the experience of approaching death and working through our experiences of essentially of confronting death. And she says, if you are facing death, the most important thing you can do is to engage with your life. If you're facing death, which we all are, we're all in varying speeds and degrees and frames, we're all approaching death. Like none of us are immune that I'm aware of. So if you're facing death, all of us, the most important thing you can do is to engage with your life. And what she meant by this is to really be with the experiences that you're having now. And even if you can't enjoy them necessarily all the time, to be present with them and to find ways to engage in your life where you feel joy, where you feel appreciation, where you find deep meaning. And this is such a central factor to this topic for me, because we're going to talk about the ways in which, in contrast, we don't engage with our life. And so please keep in mind, I don't know if I said this in the beginning, when I'm doing this research, it's really intended for, I'm thinking about psychotherapists, but also helpers, healers of any kind. So anyone that's in the helping healing field, this can be anyone from nurses, doctors, even teachers, spiritual practitioners, of course, therapists and counselors. Anyone that holds space for other people, that creates a container of space and hopefully healing. Now, I'm going to start with the end. And so so just stay with me here. So why I wanted to start with this, because I wanted to share with you why the Psychopomp, understanding the Psychopomp, the guide of souls after death, why this is so important for us as helpers and healers, and why we need to know about this now. Because basically you might be like, Shawna, why do we care? Why is this important? So this is important because the concept of the wounded healer is hurting us. And the wounded healer archetype, the wounded healer storyline comes from the Greek myth of Chiron, where Chiron was this master healer. He became wounded by his own arrow. And then in order to relieve his suffering, he sacrificed his own life for someone else. And then only that act was what relieved his suffering. And the psychoanalyst Carl Jung said that only a wounded physician can heal. Only someone who is wounded can bring healing to others. And I think that this correlation between the wounded healer myth and helpers, healers, therapists, counselors, that can be helpful for us to contextualize how our pain can have purpose, how our woundedness and healing and traumatic experiences that we've had, how that can have meaning, and the meaning is to help others. Now, I also realized that the wounded healer storyline is also hurting us, because there's this unspoken message that as helpers and healers, we must sacrifice our entire life in order to help others. That if we are not sacrificing everything, working ourselves down to the bone to max capacity, then we are not really being helpers and healers, and we are not helping our clients. And now this is not, again, this is looking at the myth from a depth perspective, looking at the unconscious messages that we're receiving through this myth without even realizing it. And we see this coming through in the field of mental health, in the field of psychology, where a majority of psychotherapists are experiencing high levels of burnout consistently across the board. And there have been many meta-analysis and studies that have shown that, some studies will say 50% of therapists experience high levels of burnout. Some say as high as 80%. And to me, this is not acceptable. It's not sustainable, and it's a massive problem in our field, not just in the field of psychology, but also any field where someone is doing helping and healing work, that there is this tendency to give everything. And I think that this is a reflection of that. The wounded healer is telling us that we need to give everything, and that is not sustainable, and that is not the case. Now, what to do with this, right? So I'm sharing that with you because the Psychopomp Function, which I'll explain to you what that is in a moment. The Psychopomp Function gives us, as helpers and healers, an alternative frame. It gives us, rather than only having the wounded healer as this exalted way of being, it gives us an empowering emblem, especially for depth psychotherapists and anyone who works in the spiritual healing field. It gives us an empowering emblem, especially for those of us who already tend towards self-sacrifice, for those of us who already tend to overgive and have challenges with receiving, with reciprocity. Those of us who are so incredibly excited about helping others and doing this work, and that, a lot of us have challenges around valuing our own presence in our own work. So I love the Psychopomp Function. I think it's so important because it provides this counterbalance for the wounded healer. And I'm not saying that we should totally get rid of the wounded healer archetype or storyline as an inspiration for healing work. But it feels, based on what's happening in our field, that we need something that bolsters up the sense of valuing our own life and looking at healing through a different lens, through a different sort of function. The other piece of this too is that the wounded healer is based on one myth, a Greek myth. And we see, in contrast, psychopomps throughout many different cultures. Now, I don't consider the psychopomp an archetype because it is not universally present in all cultures, times, and places. But it is a reoccurring symbol, which allows for us to draw symbolically from a wider variety of cultural contexts. So my question, Shawna, what's the question? How did you actually do your research? So that's kind of the conclusion that I came to. And I'll share with you what my process was. So I was really drawn to the Psychopomp symbol. I had heard that the Psychopomp is a guide of souls, especially after death, but Psychopomp as an idea has been correlated to people who do work with folks who are in transition in any way. So this is like death doulas or people that are emergency service workers. And I had even heard, sort of in passing, the Psychopomp correlated to psychotherapists. But when I looked into this more, there was not really anything elaborating on that idea, which was kind of shocking to me. And so my research question was, in what ways is a depth psychotherapist acting as a psychopomp? And now again, I think that this idea could be elaborated to in what ways are helpers and healers acting as a psychopomp. But for the purpose of this research, I needed to focus it. So, spoiler, the short answer is several. There are several ways in which depth psychotherapists in particular are functioning in a way that is psychopompic. And in fact, depth psychotherapists may invoke the psychopomp as a function of their work. So let's discuss. So initially, when I was looking into what is a psychopomp, how is it defined in the literature, through mythology, scholars, through psychology, and psychopomp has even been correlated to the indigenous healing practices in Siberia. We usually call that shamanism. And so I looked at how is it that we're defining a psychopomp, which I found to be sort of an unsatisfying definition. Essentially, a psychopomp is a guide of souls after death. So it's a figure, which is a deity, can be seen as an animal or even a human, in the case of a shaman, who guides and accompanies a soul through other worlds, usually to a final resting place, and most often after a literal or metaphorical death. And so I was very curious to sort of explore and elaborate on that more, because that felt very general to me, whereas we have so much literature about other mythological archetypes like the wounded healer and the Greek myths have been thoroughly explored. And so I wanted to sort of do that for the psychopomp. So the way that I decided to approach this was through looking cross-culturally and comparing as many psychopomp figures and as many myths as I could find. And so I intentionally reviewed and researched figures in mythology who were benevolent figures that guided souls after death. I found 15 psychopomp figures, which I'll figure out a way to put that in the description of this video. I don't want to list those all out now. And I was really curious to do this because, this was the other thing, was that Mercury, or Hermes, in Greek mythology, is sort of seen as the psychopomp par excellence. And so this is like when people talk about the psychopomp, they talk about Hermes or Mercury. And I found my initial sort of, what do I call this? My initial suspicion was that when we talk about the psychopomp, I found a lot of, I found several psychology texts where they talked about the psychopomp as having sort of like a trickstery kind of shape-shifting nature. And my suspicion was that we were sort of mixing psychopomp, which is a reoccurring symbol in several different cultures, that we were mixing that with Mercury's in particular. And we were saying, well, Hermes or Mercury is this way, and so that means that a psychopomp is this way. Which is not always the case. Not all psychopomps are tricksters. They all have their unique qualities based on their cultural context, but then they also have these unifying characteristics and tools that they have in common as psychopomps, but then they're going to have their own variation based on the culture. I hope that makes sense. So, through this process of looking at psychopomps, and maybe I'll tell you a couple. So I looked at Anubis from Egyptian mythology, Azrael, the archangel, Morning Star in Australian mythology, Charon, Diana, deer and dogs also showed up a lot as psychopomps. Epona, Hecate, Hermes, of course, horses, interestingly, Krishtagarbha in Japanese myths, the Valkyries, Vanth and Zolo, I think I'm saying that right, in in Mexican mythology. So I looked through all of these and sort of was looking for what are their tools and like actions that they all tend to sort of do in common. And I found 4 patterns that naturally emerged. First was that these figures, the psychopomps, accompanied souls through the other worlds without being harmed themselves. So the thing with transitioning through the other world is it's usually seen as a treacherous place. And I thought it was very interesting that all of these figures were able to go through the other world with the soul, and that the psychopomp themselves was able to make that journey without being harmed in some way. So they had that strength and that capability to move through the other world. Number 2 is that sight was very important via either light or torches or infinite eyes. Both Vanth and Azrael in their mythology, they have infinite eyes on their wings. Hecate has her torch. And the morning star in Australian mythology is actually Venus, this light. So light, torches, eyes, sight. This was a very common reoccurring symbol that allowed to illuminate through the other world. The third theme was that all of the psychopomps acted as protective guardians. They had not just benevolence toward the soul that they were accompanying, but also this sense of protective. It felt different when I was reading the myths in the literature. It wasn't necessarily a caretaking, but it was a guardian. It was protective. And always like accompanying with, rather than power over, if that makes sense. And then the 4th pattern was that the psychopomps met the soul at the moment of death to embark on a long, important, and permanent journey. So this was always invoked at the moment of death, no other time. It's not like you could be like, hey, I want to connect with a psychopomp and, chit chat and then go back to my life. No, it was at that particular moment, not before or after. And then a journey commenced that was long, arduous, and permanent. It was not like a going back and forth sort of situation for the soul in particular. The soul was making a permanent change. And so how does this correlate to depth psychotherapy? So depth psychotherapy is a broad term, and it really encompasses several different specializations in therapy. So, and they each have their own sort of model of the human mind. So when I was looking at this, I was considering the umbrella of depth. When I say depth psychotherapy, it's deep like the ocean depth. It includes psychotherapy models and approaches such as Jungian psychology, psychodynamic, psychoanalytic, Jungian sand play. Am I missing anything? Yes, and also archetypal psychology from James Hillman's school of thought. So all of those different styles have things in common, and then they have their very specific approaches. And so what I wanted to do was sort of say, okay, what are we saying when we say depth psychology? What does that mean? And I wanted to sort of define that for myself because I wanted to compare psychopomps to depth, but I didn't want to get lost in the weeds of the particular nuances of each individual system. And so I reviewed, I think, maybe like 10, I don't know, I didn't count them yet, 10 or so different authors in those fields from those different orientations in depth psychology. And I found 4 unifying principles that emerged that I could use to say this is what defines and differentiates a depth psychotherapist versus a therapist who is oriented in cognitive behavioral therapy. And I will share with you what these are. So the first unifying principle for depth psychotherapists was that this is the most important one, that we are oriented toward the unconscious. So depth psychotherapy, we're constantly wanting to explore and discover and bring unconsciousness into consciousness. Like that's the thing. Like that's it. That's the stuff. And there are so many different ways, different techniques of doing that, and different ways of conceptualizing what the unconscious even is. But that's the main mode of, that's one main unifying principle. The second is that depth psychotherapists use what we call our phenomenological eye. And this is a fancy way of saying that we think symbolically. That if a client is talking about something in session and then there's like a loud sound outside or something drops in the room, or even the client is, I'll give you an example from my own practice. When I was working with middle schoolers in my practicum in my initial training, there were so many times where the client the youth would create a work of art. We would do a lot of art projects. We wouldn't necessarily talk about feelings because kids process things differently than adults. They process symbolically. And so there were so many times where the youth would create this art project that specifically spoke to the challenge that they were having. Maybe they created a collage that depicted figures who had like all different kinds of gender presentations when that youth was working through their own gender identity. Or maybe if they were really experiencing grief and loss, there was a lot of artwork that involved like a lot of dark images and things that look like whirlpools and abysses and things like this. And so in depth psychotherapy, we're not taking anything at face value. We're always looking at, what is it symbolically that is being communicated to us? The third unifying principle is that depth psychotherapists use relational experiences, the therapy relationship, to transform. And so this is not really the case in cognitive behavioral therapy. Cognitive behavioral therapy is more about giving a person homework and techniques to do for themselves, whereas depth psychotherapy is actively looking at, okay, what is happening in the room, and how can the client relate to the therapist in a way that helps them to work out old problems in a new way. And this is because we consider therapy so relational. So that relational experience is important. And then the fourth thing is that in depth psychotherapy, depth psychotherapists, one of their goals is to restructure the psyche in order to alleviate suffering. And this is not like, in contrast, this is not like alleviating a symptom, at a superficial level. This is like totally restructuring the personality often. And I know that sounds kind of dramatic. Often it's more subtle than it sounds, but it's about restructuring the way that we're organized on the inside. It's about creating very deep change, and that alleviates the suffering. Now, I hope that this makes sense. So I didn't intend for it to be 4 principles or qualities with the Psychopomp and then 4 qualities with depth psychotherapists, but it sort of worked out that way, and I went with it. And I found that these all correlated very beautifully. So where depth psychotherapists are oriented toward the unconscious, psychopomps are walking through other worlds with folks. And the unconscious has been correlated to another world. The unconscious has been talked about by psychotherapists as this wild terrain that we can't ever really know or see. And it is that therapy is so helpful because you often benefit from, or even sometimes need someone to walk on that path with you, because it is so unknown and murky and can be sort of scary sometimes. So that was the first correlation, is that depth psychotherapists are acting like psychopomps in that they're oriented towards the unconscious and they are walking through the other world with people in the way that psychopomps are. The second correlation is that we talked about depth psychotherapists using their phenomenological eye, their symbolic eye, and this really correlated to psychopomps using illumination through light or through eyes. That felt like such a clear connection there. And then, of course, we talked about depth psychotherapists using the therapeutic relationship to create transformation. And this felt very connected to the psychopomp's guardianship and protective quality. Whereas the psychopomp is not doing everything for the person that they're accompanying. They're sort of like shepherding you. And yes, the psychopomp is known as a guide of souls, but I feel when I look at the actions that they're taking in the midst, it's really more about accompanying the soul. And again, it has that protective kind of quality to it. And this is a highly relational phenomenon, where it's not like a psychopomp is like, oh yeah, like here's a map and these are some directions and sends you on your way. No, the psychopomp goes with you on that journey. And that is a relational experience. And then the last piece is that depth psychotherapists are really have a goal, usually working with their clients, of restructuring the psyche to alleviate suffering. And this is very connected to the psychopomp's role in the death rebirth process. And so often in psychotherapy, in depth psychotherapy, that process has been correlated to a death and rebirth, that there is something that falls away, that is surrendered, and then new life springs up internally, sometimes externally in a person's life. And so this felt very connected, that the restructuring, it often, and I talk about this in my thesis, is my experience has been that psychotherapy can feel like at times like a metaphorical death and rebirth process. And so depth psychotherapists, they're really working with this, in this area of symbolic death and rebirth. And so, okay, I'm going to take a sip of tea. So I wonder, all of this might be a little boring. I don't know. If there's anything that resonates, I would love to hear. Or if you have questions, you're like, Shawna, what do you mean by this? Because I am going through things fairly quickly. And the goal was to, especially presenting this this weekend when I present this on campus, the goal is to present sort of like a summary. But I spent quite a bit of time on this topic, as if you've ever done a research project, I'm sure that you're familiar with that. So what's the conclusion, like to bring this all home? So when I was really sitting with this and looking how clear it is that depth psychotherapists really mirror the function of the psychopomp. And I'm calling it a function because it's essentially a way of being, or a collection of actions that are occurring via one figure, via one person or deity, etc. So my conclusion was essentially that the psychopomp function can serve as an empowering emblem for psychotherapists. It tells us that, and we're contrasting this with the wounded healer archetype. So it tells us that depth psychotherapists are called to this work, to this vocation, not because we are permanently wounded, not because we are self-sacrificers, but because we have a special connection to the psychopomp function. Because we walk between worlds, because we are protectors, because we illuminate what is hidden, and we thrive in this psychic and cyclic death rebirth process. Marion Woodman and Eleanor Dixon said in their book Dancing in the Flames that out of the darkness will come the treasures, and the hidden riches. And so my hope is that this gave you something to chew on, something to think about, and maybe a new way of thinking about helpers, healers, therapists, and the process of psychotherapy, and a new way of thinking about your work and your presence as a helper and healer, if that is something that you're doing. So as always, I love feedback and questions. Thank you so much for those of you that have been on the live with me. And if you're listening to the recording, thank you so much for being here as well. If you have feedback or questions, feel free to email me or to leave a comment wherever you're listening here. And if you are interested in reading about this more, I have my thesis published as a book on Amazon, and so I'll leave a link to that below. I'm wishing you a wonderful rest of the week, and I'll see you next week. So next week we'll start with we'll go back to Instagram, Astro Chat, live stream every Friday at 9 a.m. Pacific time. And usually it's more chatting about astrology. This was sort of like a special episode. So I will see you then. Bye.